Hi and welcome back to Bike Speeds. This week we're going to deal with this Scott Plasma. This is an absolutely epic service, this one. It was all about the internals on this bike. As you can see, this rider keeps this bike mint. But we're going to replace all the brake cables. We're going to sort out this issue with this headset here that is moving around. You can see that and hear that there moving. We're going to sort out this loose fitting on the front of the bike. We're going to sort out this wheel here that is binding. As the wheel is turning, you can hear it there binding on the brake. So that's an issue that we need to sort out. And also we had this rattling battery internally in the bike. Again, all things that a rider using this bike day to day may not be able to solve or sort out themselves, and that's where we come in. We also had this clicking sound. It was from the internal routed cables catching on the headset there, so we need to address that when we do the cables. But as you can see here, this bike is absolutely mint. There is nothing wrong with it externally. You can see there the chain is in excellent condition, as is the rest of the bike at face value, but boy did it need this service, and what a huge difference we're going to make to this bike. So you can see there we've got this binding front brake. It's just sticking shut. Initially I assumed that was because the cable was deteriorating, but there's a specific reason why that cable was binding and why that brake was sticking like that, which is just astounds me really. You can see here the rider keeps this bike absolutely mint. Look how clean that cassette is. It's an absolute credit to this rider, the condition that this bike came in terms of cleanliness and the way it was maintained at home level. We're going to get all the Di2 off of this bike, because we actually need to get the junction box out from inside to do some work. So we'll get all these parts off. Again here, this is a safety washer. It shouldn't be floating around loose like that. We need to address that when we put this chain set back on the bike. That should be tucked down. It actually hooks onto the second bolt so that the arm can't come off. It's got a little peg in there that sits inside the chain set. So it's important that when we put that back on, that is sorted out as well. I'm also now removing the bottom bracket bearing. When I felt that with my fingers, it was very, very rough to the touch one side, so we need to do the bottom bracket bearing on this. I consulted the customer to say that I felt that would be advised to replace that during this service, and he agreed to go ahead with that. So we're now taking off all the components. We'll get this cover off of here so we can really weigh out what's going on with this brake. Initially I released the brake and I took that component off of the bike, and it wasn't until a little bit further down the line of this service I realised why that brake was binding the way it was. Now out come the cups. Originally I didn't think I was going to have to take the cups out, but then I realised that I needed to remove the junction box for the Di2, and look at this, I couldn't believe this. A plastic bag around the junction box to stop it rattling or moving in the frame. I've never seen that on all the Di2 I've worked on, and I've worked on a lot of it, to have a plastic bag tucked up a frame. I was just astounded, and so it went on with this bike and the nature of this job. These internal routed cables were by far the trickiest, most complex and difficult ones I've ever replaced. This was what was causing that clicking noise. The outer had come off of that internal cable, it chewed up. You can see there the inside of that external cabling, so we need to get that right out of the bike. And also this bike was wired up differently to the way we ride in the UK. You wanted the brake levers swapped over so that the right became the front brake, the left becomes the rear brake. They were the opposite way around when the bike came in, so we're going to get those cables and outers right out of this bike. But even this, we had that funny stem in the centre, then we had these handlebars with a very tight bend inside them. It was all complex and awkward, and this filming makes it look an awful lot easier. But this is the reason why that front brake was binding and sticking. Because yes, there's no outer on that and those cables are frayed off, but believe it or not, this is a gear cable outer. This bike doesn't even have cabled gears, it's Di2, but that was a gear cable outer. It's narrower and thinner than a normal brake, because brake cables are wider than gear cables, so it was never going to be running smooth from the day that was fitted. Again, that's something I've never seen. I don't know why that was done like that, but this bike was certainly put together by someone who probably didn't really enjoy bikes. I don't know how this bike ever ended up put together in the way that it was. We've swapped that one over now. We're going to swap over the other one as well, get the new outer in through the handlebars before we refit them onto the bike. So I had to undo the bar tape as well in order to get these brakes off because of the Di2 cable travelling on the outside there, so that was held by the bar tape. So in order to get this all out, that had to come off, using the cable guides there to get the new cables through, just to make sure everything's nice and smooth and running nice and smoothly through the handlebars. With this kind of internal routed cabling, it's very important to do things without pulling, tugging, damaging in any way. You've just got to smoothly get everything back into the bike so that the travel for the internal cable there remains smooth throughout the frame. But with this stem here and that handlebar set up and the tight bends that it was all going around, it was really tricky. Just going to put a bit of our copper grease onto the threads of these bolts, because inevitably in the lifespan of this bike it's all going to have to come apart again, so we don't want anything binding inside the frame. So again, copper grease onto the adjuster there for the front brake, and I used a little bit of our general purpose grease on the inside of that as well to allow the cable to sit in there and spin in that nicely. So here you can see the headset bearings, very rusty, very tight and broken up on that top one. That was the one that was giving all the movement in the heads of this bike when it was moving around as it was. So I clean up the cups, get rid of the old bearings, get fresh bearings in there, and that will then sit nicely, and the heads should stop all that movement that we had in this bike. Just use a little bit of our premium grease there to seat the bearings. You don't necessarily need it, but it will stop any galvanic corrosion or any corrosion within the headset. But put a little bit of grease on your bearings, it helps them all seat into place and makes that a nice fit into the bearings themselves, and I've got that now nice. Next up, I'm going to get this rear brake cable back into the frame using that cable guide that I put in when I took the old one out, and again the Di2 cable goes back into the frame, which again I had to take out in order to get this entire stem system off the bike, and then on goes the cap, and I'm now happy that I've got all the top end of the frame done. So we can reconnect the junction box there, and I'm just using self-adhesive foam that we use on this kind of fitting. It's a very soft padded foam that it's about 6mm thick or so, so that's now got a nice padding around that junction box, which is way better to me than a crusty old bag inside the frame. It's a little bit more permanent and a little bit nicer. And next up, I need to get that seat post out, and this is what was trying to stop the battery rattling. Some kind of foamy packaging, God knows where that's come from or why it is even there. It did serve no purpose at all to stop the battery rattling. So the way I'm going to do it is I've got this tube in here, it's a foam tubing. I'm going to put a cable tie through the middle of it, and I'm just going to put that around that little lip of the battery so that it can't go up or down. And the area that that battery went in was very narrow. That battery tapping left and right that was causing the rattling that we had. I left the tail on that tie wrap that I've put on there because that will just stop it also moving forward and backwards within that small gap, and the padding itself will stop it rattling around. With the seat post clamp, you can see there the head of the Allen key was wrung off and rounded, so I'm going to put a new Allen bolt in there, a little bit of copper grease on there as well just to stop that binding any galvanic or dissimilar metal corrosion, and I put a little bit of carbon paste onto the clamp itself just to make sure that seat post doesn't drop within the frame when the bike's being ridden. So that goes in, and I'm quite happy now that that problem with that rattling battery is solved. So I've put the cassette and chain into the ultrasonic cleaner, and while that's going away in there, I'm going to wash down the other components. There was actually very little else needed to go in the ultrasonic cleaner on this one. Di2 I never ultrasonic clean, I just wash that down by hand as I'm doing right now. And then I also washed down the chain set. Again, most of these components were immaculate, they really didn't need cleaning, but it's part of our process where we check everything as we're doing it. So it's not just about the cleaning, it's about checking the components to make sure everything about them integrally is correct and okay to go back on the bike. So even things like these jockey wheels, used a little bit of brake cleaner on these because it doesn't then impregnate the bearings that are in those, because it evaporates very quickly, and once I put that back together I know that they're absolutely fine. So I'm using a little bit of Loctite there on the pivot points for the jockey wheels themselves just to make sure that they don't come undone on the bike. And then I'm using our lubricants here, which as you can see we've got 5 different lubricants. We sell those on our website. Do check out the link in the description below. So we use a nice thin oil here on the pivot points of the derailleur, and then I'm going to use our premium grease there on the springs just to stop those going rusty by wiping that over them. thin oil on the pivot of the quick release skewer, general purpose grease down its shaft to stop that rusting or getting stuck within the axle, again copper grease on the threads so that they will come undone in the future. And even things like your brakes, thin oil on the pivot points as we're doing there, and here we're using our silicone grease on the actual sliders of the spring. And next up I'm going to deal with why this front cover was rattling. This threaded bolt here I don't think was original to the bike, but it had been wound into the brake, so it started to form a thread but hadn't gone fully through that top pivot of the brake. So I tapped that out so that it is now the same thread rate and correct as that bolt is, because the bolt actually served the correct purpose and fitted nicely on that cover, and that's now ready to go back on. So I checked the chain set bolts with the torque wrench just to make sure they're okay, and now I can now wash down the frame. I'm happy with all the mechanical components and the things that we've done to the bike so far. Again, it was immaculate, but it's always good for me to just wash them down. I can get like behind the chain set there to make sure that that's all clean, maybe little areas that the customer couldn't. Now listen to this. There's a sloshing sound in that back wheel, and again it's something I don't think I've ever seen before, but when I took the cover off the valve it was full of water. There was enough water in there to create that sloshing sound. That water obviously is a corrosion problem potentially for the spokes and the wheel themselves, but not only that, we don't want to ride along with a sloshing back wheel. So syringe that out, and now I'm using our general purpose grease on the body of the cassette hub, and I'm putting the cassette on there. That will stop that corroding to it and make sure that goes on nicely, and I torqued that up to 40 Newton meters. Next up with this wheel, I want to realign the Continental logo there over the valve hole. Not only is that aesthetically pleasing, but it also helps you identify where you're getting punctures. If you have to have this wheel off on the side of the road, and you may even have the same puncture twice, you can determine whether it was in the same spot on the tyre and whether you cleared it the first time. So it's good practice to line up your logos. And I'll inflate that tyre up now. So we also cut some vinyl covers for this wheel. It originally had duct tape over the valve, but this looks far better. We also gave the customer a couple of spares so that he could replace it, which is a nicer way of presenting the wheel and finishing it for his racing. He can inflate his tyres and get the covers back on there. Next up, new bottom bracket bearing pressed into the frame, and on goes that chain set. So we're really beginning to march on and get this bike back together now. So on goes that pedal arm correctly with that retaining washer, that safety washer, putting it in correctly this time so that I now know that's safe and ready to go. And then we can just re-plug in the Di2 components and make sure that they're all operating correctly as well. So we torque those up as we go. On the chain set and the front derailleur, I always torque those up as I go, and then we're going to put the front brake on, which again with this, as I put it on, I will torque it up, because once the cover's on there I can't then do that, so it makes my job a little bit easier if I do that along the way. Get the new tail on the cable, and here we go with the torque wrench just to make sure everything there is spot on, and I'm now happy that's working correctly. So on goes that cover with that lovely new thread in the brake, and you can see no rattling on that cover now. So that's one rattle that we've sorted out, along with the seat post. That's the second rattle we've sorted out. We've already sorted out the clicking sound at the headset and the headset moving. So this bike is going to ride and feel like a completely different machine when it goes out the door. So next up, on goes that back brake. I'm also torquing that as I go, because again it has a cover. Now the cover that went onto this one actually had some bolts that had two larger heads for the cover, and they were actually stuck out once it was done up. So I've replaced those with a slightly narrower Allen headed bolt, and that will actually make that sit nicer as well. Now the next problem that we had, I noticed this when the bike came in, the wheel was off center, it was rubbing on the frame here, and it was because those horizontal dropouts actually have that tiny little Allen key adjuster. So I'm going to adjust this one to allow that wheel to sit squarely in the frame so that it is free and not rubbing one side, and that will also center it in the brake that we've just put back on the bike. So I'm now happy that that back wheel is in correctly, and we're going to check for some updates on the Di2, and you can see there was one there on the battery. So we do that update. Wouldn't have mattered whether it was 1 or the 8 there, we would have done whatever was needed, but in this instance it was just a battery update, so we made sure that was correct. We left this on charge as well to make sure the Di2 was fully charged before the bike went out. We had a little B-screw adjustment to do on this rear derailleur, very common for these just to go straight on the bike out of the box, they always need that B screw adjusted. So we checked that as well. Check that the brakes are working. You can see the rear's fine, and now the front is spinning beautifully and working correctly. So I'm quite happy with that. And now we can run through the bike with a torque wrench on the remainder of the bolts that we didn't torque up as we were building the bike up. A lot of these on this bike we actually did as we went, but we do go through the bike with a torque wrench on every bolt that we can get to, so we check that. I also tapped out this top tube fittings. Both of those, the threads on them were a little bit dicey, so I tapped those out to make sure they were still working and hadn't corroded up. The customer did have a bag he'd taken off, so we know these were in use, and I've put a vinyl circle on there to cover up the scratching around that hole. It's a nice way of detailing to finish it off. Nothing left but to oil the chain. As you can see from these before and afters, visually there's not a lot of difference to this bike, but internally this is a different bike to what came in through the shop. This rider is going to thoroughly enjoy this bike. He's about to do an Ironman on this bike, so I wish him all the very best of luck with that distance triathlon, and I appreciate that he lent us the bike for filming. So if you've enjoyed this bike, please do subscribe, please do check out our website, leave us a comment, and we'll see you again next week. Bye for now.